you're all good. Okay, well, that was a lot of Q&A at the beginning. So let's dive right into the passage. And I'm sorry if I wasted anybody's time with chatter about stuff that you guys might not really care about. So, but I also hope I answered some questions, so, and belayed some fears. Okay, here's the link for the passage today. Give me 1 second. All right. There's the link. Okay. All right. So we're going to do this volunteer style as usual. There's 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. Let's see. So we're going to do 3 volunteers. We're going to read together. For those of you that haven't done this before, I'm going to read a sentence or a phrase to you, and then you're going to be like, Ala, I think this is what it means. And then we're going to break it down. We're just going to have a conversation about it as we go along. And then at the end, I'm going to send you all off to do the questions. Any questions about that? Okay. Who wants to take on the first paragraph? Okay, Ankita. Give me 1 second. And then Arushi, I'll come to you for the second paragraph. I think that's what you're volunteering for. Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. Many legal theorists have argued that the only morally legitimate goal in imposing criminal penalties against certain behaviors is to prevent people from harming others.
Yeah, so I think this makes sense so far, but I'm sort of alarmed at the word only. Like, can't there be other legitimate reasons for why we impose these penalties?
Yeah, it's a bit it's a bit reductive to say the least, right? And I think that you reacting that way is super normal, especially because usually in these passages the author's like, well, duh, that's dumb, right? But also, like, you don't need to suppress your humanity or suppress like the chatterbox in your brain, right? I actually tell my students sometimes, like, there's no thought police on the LSAT, right? Nobody in your brain is going to police you for thinking things or wondering about things or thinking of examples that may not be all that great. Don't discriminate against different thoughts in your brain as you take this test in. That's really important because it allows you, the less resistance you add to your thoughts, the more creative you're going to be able to be as you take in the passage. So if you ever find yourself like, don't think that, that's a stupid example, right? That kind of negative self-talk can kind of interrupt what you're doing with the passage, if that makes sense. Anyway, take your point, Ankita. All right. Clearly, such theorists would oppose laws that force people to act purely for their own good or refrain from certain harmless acts purely to ensure conformity to some social norm.
Yeah, so this was kind of a lot, but the one thing that stood out to me was the word clearly, and I was like, well, how do we know clearly? Are you going to explain it that theorists would, in fact, oppose these laws?
Yeah, so what do we know about these theorists so far, Ankita? Like in the first sentence, we know that the only legitimate goal in putting these penalties down is to prevent bad behavior. And we also know that the theorists would oppose these laws that force these kinds of actions, right? Do we know anything else? Like, are you feeling like these theorists are maybe people the author likes or doesn't like? Any idea of that?
I'm getting the vibe that he doesn't, or whoever the author is, doesn't like them because it's has like the first POV of the legal theorist, and then it doesn't have like, I'm expecting there to be more like an contrasting point of view.
Yeah, and there is no right or wrong to, answer to the one that I just asked, Ankita. The whole point is to ask yourself the question, like, okay, where is it going? Okay, so we know that the theorists are like, hey, if you're going to punish people, this is like the only reason why you get to do that, which, as a person, I kind of agree with, right? The only thing I can think of for like confining people is deterrence, which, we doesn't really work. Um, anyway, that's different. Okay. Clearly, such theorists would oppose those laws, but the goal of preventing harm to others would also justify legal sanctions against some forms of non-conforming behavior to which this goal might at first seem not to apply.
Yeah, so now I'm asking myself the original goal that legal theorists have that say that the only morally legitimate goal is to like this form of deterrence. I'm like, well, now is the author saying that there is not only one morally legitimate, maybe there's more than one?
Well, that seems possible. I'm curious though, because they're saying the goal, what are they talking? What is the goal going to be doing here? Is it going to be like promoting something? Is it going to be establishing something? What's the verb, I guess, that they're using here in the last sentence that tells you like what they're doing with the goal?
They're justifying the
Yes.
sanctions.
Right. So they're saying, but the goal that they're talking about would also justify. So they're not talking about another goal, right? They're talking about another justification of the goal. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, it's the same goal, but it serves a different purpose.
Right. And what is the purpose that they're kind of trying, they're starting to get at?
It's that they are instead of deterring them, they're sort of making an excuse for that behavior, I guess.
Well, they're making an excuse for that behavior, but they're also talking about non-conforming behavior, right? Would non-conforming behavior to you seem like something that this author or these theorists are really thinking about?
Yeah, I think that word kind of tripped me up because when I think of that, like inferring, I'm just thinking about not like non-compliance, but I don't know
Yeah.
if that's the same thing.
No, non-compliance is very similar to non-conforming, right? People that don't fit,
Hmm.
right? So we're talking about some connection with the goal of the legitimate goal of imposing penalties, criminal penalties, and then non-conformity, which
Hmm.
I don't know what you mean, like dressing a certain way, like is that the kind of stuff like that you're talking about? Like where is the conformity coming from?
Yeah, like my question is it the same thing as them doing a criminal action, I guess?
Yep, very fair question. Awesome. Arushi, you ready?
Yes.
Okay. In many situations, it is in the interest of each member of a group to agree to behave in a certain way on the conditions that the others similarly agree.
So I think this is sort of an example lending support to the last line, which says that sometimes non-conforming behavior should like preventing harm means that non-conforming behavior should also be sanctioned, and sort of this supports that people should sometimes agree to behave similarly in a sense.
I think that's right, right? Like some kind of custom, like I can't think of an example, but maybe like we all, I guess, agree to go through TSA. Maybe that's not really a situation we agree to in the same sense, but some version of that, right? We do stuff that we know protects everybody else, like maybe getting a vaccination. In the simplest cases, a mere coordination of events is itself the good that results.
Yeah, so like sort of supporting the his own assertion that it's not that these laws should not only apply when it's harming others but in other non-conforming cases as well. So he basically says sometimes coordination of the activities is itself good and that's why it should apply. I think I just feel till now the entire passage is very abstract, that's why it's hard to like make sense of what the author is saying. But
Yes.
yeah.
Arushi, I think you're totally correct about that. It is abstract, and these harder passages tend to be abstract. So you need to come up with examples. You need to, even if you don't come up with examples, find some way to make it make sense. And I think you're doing that. You're talking about like stuff that maybe isn't like bad on its face. It's just stuff that like maybe is good when we all work together. For example, oh, thank God. It is in no one's interest to lack a convention about which side of the road to drive on. and each person can agree to drive on one side, assuming the others do too.
Yeah, so this is like one, finally, an example. This is one example wherein if you're driving on the other side of the road, wrong side of the road, it's not necessarily bad, but again, why are you doing it? Why are you non-conforming? This is
Right.
like a situation where the author would believe that a rule is justified to be applicable, even though there is no apparent badness or like harm that is on the face of it.
Right, exactly. So I don't know what the criminal penalties are for driving on the wrong side of the road, but it does seem like it would be pretty severe given that, you're endangering people. But I don't know, is that like a deterring harm thing or is that a convention thing? I'm still curious about that. But I'm starting to see their point, right? They're talking about like, hey, this isn't stuff that like this doesn't seem like we're preventing harm, but like we are preventing harm because when we do this the right way, there's a lot of good that comes from it.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, any fair rule then would be better than no rule at all.
So I think this sentence challenges like the first sentence of the legal theorists when they argue that it's only morally legitimate to have rules when there is certain harm to other people. So the author here says that it's better to have a rule in this case than having no rule at all.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yep. On the assumption that all people would voluntarily agree to be subject to a coordination rule backed by criminal sanctions. Sorry if the sirens are loud. So, okay, so on the assumption that all people would voluntarily agree to this kind of like drive on the same side of the road, which I hope they would, if people could be assured that other people would also agree, it's argued to be legitimate for a legislature to impose such a rule.
So I think this sentence is another example. So the author is basically arguing against the legal theorists here, saying against their assertion that it's only morally legitimate when it harms others. But the author introduces a new condition saying that if everyone agrees and the legislature also passes this, that's another way for a rule to be legitimate.
Exactly. This is because they're giving you some backup here. This is because prevention of harm underlies the rationale for this rule. Right. So you don't crash into somebody. Though it applies to the problem of coordination less directly than to other problems. So maybe like you can't murder somebody, like no shit, right? Like that seems very clearly connected to the harm. Whereas like driving on the wrong side of the road is, well, maybe I'm crazy because I'm immediately thinking of people dying in car crashes, but they do say they are saying like, hey, it's less direct, but you have to think of the harm prevention underneath too. Okay, so then the sentence keeps going. It's really long. So let's pause here. What do you think so far, Rishi?
So I think here the author says that there is no there's no harm on the face that is occurring, but the rationale is there's an underlying sense of harm. So maybe rules and penalties should also extend to such cases wherein there is no harm at where there is harm that underlies things, but not
Yeah.
necessarily at the face value of things. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. For the act that is forbidden, driving on the other side of the road, is not inherently harm producing. I don't know about that. As burglary and assault. Instead, it is the lack of a coordinating rule that would be harmful.
Um, so I think here I would agree. I would agree with you. I think driving on the road on the wrong side is harmful, but I'll just take the author for what's written there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the author is really focusing on the coordination part here. I think his entire argument derives from the fact that because you're not coordinating, there is harm that results from that, and then
Yeah.
we are justified to have rules preventing that. So I think that's the
Yeah.
gist.
Right. And here's, I think, a really good point to stress that like Arushi is doing, which is like, we don't fully understand exactly what they're getting at when they say like driving on the other side of the road is not harmful, but we can make room for the author's point, right? So if you find yourself ever going like, I don't feel like I completely agree with the author or understand where they're going, don't worry, you don't have to. You can still make room for what they're talking about without doing that. The other thing is, like, if Arushi were to punch me in the face, like that's assault, and that would be immediately harmful to me. But if Arushi was going to drive on the wrong side of the road, maybe like on a highway that people barely use, like that's not inherently, like on its face, like, Arushi punching me in the face it would not be the same thing. So I think that's the distance they're creating between those two. So it's good to keep track of those ideas. You did a great job, Arushi. Thank you. Who wants to take the last paragraph with me? Oh, come on. Don't make me call on somebody. This is an opportunity to learn and grow. King, do you want to read with me? You don't have to. You don't have to. You can always say pass. Pass. All right. Who wants to read with me? Kayla.
I'm a little nervous because I suck at RC, but I'm ready to go. Let's do it.
I'm proud for you volunteering when you're not feeling like you're confident about it. That's when we learn. When we're a little uncomfortable, when we feel a little nervous, that's how we learn. So you're already winning. You've already done more for your legal career than I have today, which is nothing because I haven't done enough today to work. So
Appreciate it.
in some other situations involving a need for legally enforced coordination, so we're not talking about like the road anymore, right? We're talking about other situations that maybe also need this kind of coordination. The harm to be averted goes beyond the simple lack of coordination itself.
I liked how the author brought up like it's more than like just simple coordination. At some point it goes beyond that, where it's like, okay, people being systematically like in like people understanding that there's like underlying rules to certain things without someone actually having to say something is actually important.
Yeah. And they seem to be expanding, right, Kayla? They're just like, let me tell you about more.
Yes, exactly.
This can be illustrated by an example of a coordination rule instituted by a private athletic organization which has analogies in criminal law. Okay.
The only thing that I'm really taking away from this is that the author might go into an example of like he talks about illustration. So I think he might talk about like analogies in criminal law that pertain to a private athletic organization.
Yeah, I think you're right. So the example begins, at issue is whether the use of anabolic steroids, which build muscular strength but have serious negative side effects, should be prohibited.
I believe that example goes back to like the first line that we start with, that essentially steroids are an issue. Steroids are an issue. So one, the fact that it's even a question if steroids should be used is alarming. Yeah. But the author's basically proving the first sentence of like, here's an example of why it goes beyond a simple lack of coordination itself.
Right. Because I mean, something like driving on the wrong side of the road is pretty easy to understand. Whereas like, well, what does like policing anabolic steroids have to do with preventing like harm in a coordination way? We can see like if somebody's taking steroids and we're like, don't take steroids, we can see that we're probably stopping harm. But what does that have to do with coordination? Let's find out. Each athlete has at stake both an interest in having a fair opportunity to win and an interest in good health. That makes sense, right, Kayla?
Yeah.
Don't really need to break that down. If some competitors use steroids, others have the option of either endangering their health or losing their fair opportunity to win. Thus, they would be harmed either way. Yikes.
That's a lot. I don't really, I'm a little, I guess, stumped with how to break this down, if I'm being honest.
Sure.
So
So let's back up for a second. What kind of example are we talking about? We're talking about coordination and preventing harm, right?
yes.
We're talking about anabolic steroids. Now we zoom in a little bit. We're talking about if some competitors use steroids. So I'm a Mariners fan. Let's say some people on the Mariners team are using steroids. Now, other people that are not using steroids, what is the passage saying that their options are? Like, what choices do they have?
You either use steroids or you don't. I can see, I actually now I'm grasping it. If you're not using steroids, you get harmed because you're not able to, like, let's say if a ball gets hit at you at 150 miles per hour with someone who is using steroids, what if
Right.
your reaction time's not quick enough, or like
Right.
all these different
Exactly.
aspects? So that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, right? So either I now have to subject myself to the shitty side effects of steroids in order to like keep up, or I have to lose.
Yeah.
Yep, it's not a level playing field, nor is it healthy. And now I'm starting to see, oh, so you're talking about how harm prevention isn't just like that narrow. It might also have to do with this sort of coordination thing that we're also talking about.
Yeah.
A compulsory rule, right? A required rule could prevent that harm and thus would be in the interest of all competitors.
I think here the author's like giving an alternative option to like how we can like meet people at the middle essentially,
Yeah.
and have an option that will be beneficial to everyone versus like one group benefiting over the other.
If they understand its function and trust the techniques for its enforcement, they will gladly consent to it.
When it comes to this like compulsory rule, people are going to be, sometimes people are a little bit like, I don't know if I'm trust this, how's this going to benefit me? So if people actually understand like the ins and outs of it and how it actually will be beneficial to like all parties involved, it'll be easier to get people to like actually want to um understand the rule and actually utilize it how it's supposed to be utilized.
Yep, and that makes sense, right? Like Major League Baseball players, if they know for a fact that the MLB can actually get rid of anabolic steroid use in the MLB world, if they know that they can do it and that they understand how it works, they trust the techniques for its enforcement, obviously they're all going to subject themselves to that because they all want to play in a world where they don't have to get negative, negative like side effects from steroids, nor do they want to lose the competitive edge.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense to me outside of, anabolic steroids too. I'm thinking of like the IRS, right? We all pay taxes and we all like give up money to pay taxes. But imagine if we knew, which we kind of do a little bit, that some people don't pay taxes or some people pay a lot less taxes than we do, then there's going to start to be some distrust in the system. So it's almost like when we all agree to it, we're down to like almost be we're down to give up some control in order to participate in the process. But if it doesn't work, what's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Just me thinking about it. So while it may appear that such a rule merely forces people to act for their own good, the deeper rationale for coercion here, as in the example above, is a somewhat complex appeal to the legitimacy of enforcing a rule with the goal of preventing harm.
First, so while it might appear, it's kind of like red flag, because I feel like the author's showing us like, oh, surface level it might be so grand and dandy,
Right.
but actually some people are willing to like risk it all essentially to kind of be above everyone else. And also I liked how the author here said it's more complex that it's more like creating rules that are supposed to prevent harm are more complex than we actually think. like essentially like enforcing rules to prevent harm is just so much more complex than we actually think, especially if not everyone's willing to follow them.
Yep. And specifically, I think we're ending here with the idea that, like, hey, on the face, it's looking like we're forcing people to do stuff, right? We're forcing people, like players, to have to like be monitored. And like, you know, I like once watched a Olympic like athlete video, and in there they talk about how drug testing is so serious that someone will actually follow you to the bathroom after you run a marathon to like make sure that it's like you that's peeing into the cup. And then that's like how they'll like test. I'm serious, you guys. Like, world athletes get subjected to this stuff, and that seems like we're forcing people to do stuff. And it's not. I'm not saying I'm endorsing anything, but is there a rationale that like we are preventing something greater? And is that the dichotomy the author's setting up? I think so, right? There's force involved, and it almost looks like force on the outside. But is there more legitimacy if we look deeper, and it's like we're actually trying to prevent harm to the players themselves by making sure that they don't maybe subject themselves to even worse by the steroids or by having to lose a lot. Kayla, you did a fantastic job. You had nothing to be nervous about.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, y'all. I'm going to send you off to do the questions now. There's about 6 of them. I'm going to give you about 8-9 minutes. I'll publish a poll. Fill that out as you come back in, and we'll talk about the toughest ones together. Good luck. Take another minute or so to wrap up. Fill out the poll if you haven't already. Okay, looks like that was most of you finishing up. Okay, so I'm assuming that wasn't the easiest thing in the world, which is fair. Let's look at the questions. Got a few votes on them. Let's do the main point question for this one. I think it's a worthwhile exercise to do just so that we're on the same page for the rest. It'll also give everybody else a chance to vote on the questions in the meantime. All right. Which one of the following most accurately states the main point of the passage? I think the main point of the passage is the idea that the harm prevention concept doesn't have to be limited to the things that the legal theorist thinks that we have to limit it to, right? It's got a broader scope than that. Is there another way to say that? Well, it doesn't seem like harm prevention is going to totally justify, rules around steroids, but we can actually do that, right? It's possible, at least. Okay, I think I'm following. The thing with a main point question, the only real things that you have to think about is this describing something the passage did? And is it describing the thing the author cared most about? Right? Some of them are just going to be factually wrong, but the trickiest multiple choice sort of main point answers to get rid of, the hardest ones to get rid of rather, are the ones that like seem to be talking about what the passage is talking about, but that's not enough, right? It needs to be what the author cared most about. In order to be morally justifiable. Anyone have any thoughts about whether I need to really keep reading? Alex, you're shaking your head. You want to tell me why?
Sorry, I took off the morally, there wasn't, I didn't see a lot of moral synonyms
Yeah,
in the passage, and I stopped there as well. So
I think so, right? In order to be morally, thank you, Alex. That's the observation I was looking for. In order to be morally justifiable, it almost doesn't matter what the rest of the sentence ends with, right? In order to be morally justifiable, whatever you said, whatever you finish the rest of the sentence with, it doesn't impact what the main point prediction that I had. And Reggie, I see your question. I would keep reading TBH because of the first sentence. And you're correct. There is there is a mention of morally justifiable, right? And I'm not saying that there isn't. I believe they mentioned it also in a couple, in like at least one other place. I can do like a command F. If I can spell morally. Yeah, it says morally legitimate. I thought it said moral somewhere else, but yes, it does say that. And Reggie, I'm not saying I wouldn't finish reading the rest of it. I probably would, but I'm trying to demonstrate here the idea that in order to be morally justifiable, I think we have to be clear about what that means. If we understand, is the author trying to tell us how to be morally justifiable, right? If you want to be morally justifiable, you have to go do these things. That's already an alarm bell for me. But you're correct in pointing out, hey, the first sentence mentions it, so why don't we keep reading? I love that. Laws prohibiting activities that are not inherently harm producing must apply equitably to everyone. That's strike 2 and 3 for me, right? Must apply equitably to everyone. They did mention that like people are going to want to opt in and we do care about enforcement. But the author wasn't trying to show us like, hey, if you want to be morally justifiable, you have to like definitely make sure it applies equitably to everybody. Okay. B, it's justifiable to require social conformity where non-compliance. Okay, so it's okay. It's like, it's fine to make people like conform or require people to conform when non-compliance would be harmful to either the non-conforming individual or the larger group. Remember, this passage isn't about like, hey, where's the harm? Is it to the individual or to the group? And that's like when it is justifiable. Remember, the whole point is that it's justifiable because the principle of harm prevention, right? The idea of harm prevention goes beyond what the legal theorists initially think, which is just like the only legitimate goal, like the only way we can think about it as legitimate is if it's to prevent harm, right? Prevent people from harming other people. That's not, B is maybe a part of what the author is talking about, but remember, it's not about when it's harmful to certain people, it's about how we're thinking the conformity works with the coordination and with how that eventually prevents harm. Not on the face, as Kayla said. Do we see how it's not B? Okay. C, achieving coordination can be argued for, or sorry. Are we talking about, oh, we're talking about B. Okay, it's justifiable to require social conformity. I think that's also a part of it, Reggie. Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. Remember, there's always multiple reasons why an answer choice is wrong. Wrong answers are wrong for a multitude of reasons. You're not on the hook to find all of them. As long as you find one of them, it's wrong. Achieving coordination can be argued to be a morally legitimate justification for rules that prevent directly harmful actions. Directly harmful actions. Oh, okay, so that would be the stuff they talked about in the beginning, and others that prevent indirectly harmful actions. Was the distinction between direct and indirect? Achieving coordination. Hang on. Achieving coordination can be argued to be a morally legitimate justification. Why is the subject here achieving coordination? Why is that the thing we're talking about? Wouldn't it be that the harm prevention is what, or sorry, the coordination is what we are doing to be justified by the harm prevention? Does that make any sense? Sorry if I'm talking in riddles. Because it's not that the achieving coordination can be argued to be a morally legitimate justification for the rules. It's this idea that the harm prevention justifies the coordination, right? Because we're preventing harm from happening, that's why we get to like require social conformity to these things that may not seem on their face to be harmful. Are we seeing that? Why C is wrong? C looks like the most commonly selected wrong answer, and I'm assuming several of you. Okay, that's good. Thanks for the feedback. It is reasonable to hold that restricting individual liberty is always justified, oh dear God, on the basis of mutually agreed upon community standards. No, it's a really, really different standard than the one that the author wants to abide by, right? It's not just that like, it's always justified as long as there's mutually agreed upon community standards. That's not the standard the author was talking about. It was quite different. It was quite narrow too. E, the principle of preventing harm to others can be used. Notice how can is like a weak answer, right? It's a gentle answer. It's not super strong. Can be used to justify laws that do not at first glance appear to be designed to prevent such harm. Yes. So harm prevention, we can use harm prevention as an idea to justify laws that on their face don't seem to be designed to prevent the harm, right? Like making athletes pee into a cup doesn't seem like, hey, what harm are we really preventing? But if we look at it a little bit closer, harm prevention is playing a huge role in justifying that kind of like invasion of privacy or whatever. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's do number 24. That's the winner for today. It can be most reasonably inferred from the passage that the author would agree with which one of the following statements. Okay, this is just another way of asking you, what does the author agree with? What did they actually say in the passage? A, did they say that in all situations, you should already be suspicious because it says all situations, and the stronger an answer is, the harder it is for me to prove that the author actually believes it. In all situations in which compulsory rules are needed for the coordination of human activities, all situations, any, again, very strong, right? Any uniformly enforced rule is as acceptable as any other. Oof, that's strong. So in any situation in which you need like required rules, any uniformly enforced rule is acceptable as any other. What? When did the author ever say that? When did the author go so far as to ever say that? Also, remember, you should add this kind of inflection and drama into these answer choices because it will help you see what's different among these answer choices, because it does say all and it says any twice. Those are universal sort of claims, right? All, any. Every is another one. B, no private organizational rules designed to coordinate the activities of members. Did we talk about members? Have as complex a relation to the goal of preventing harm as have some criminal statutes. When did we ever talk about comparing members and groups to criminal statutes? I have no idea. I can't ever say that the author did that. C, every fair rule that could be effectively used. Notice it says could, so it's weak. So I'm already a little bit less on guard about that. Okay, so, but it does say every though, which is strong. Oh. So every fair rule that could be effectively used, but notice could is modifying the every, right? It is saying every fair rule, but it's saying every fair rule that could be effectively used to prescribe which side of the road to drive on is a rule whose implementation would likely cause less harm than it would prevent. Again, notice how weak that second half is. Would likely cause less harm than it would prevent. That's such a low bar, right? They're just saying like, hey, as long as you've got a fair rule that can effectively tell you which side of the road to drive on, the fact that we have that rule is going to be like less harmful to have it, right? It's going to cause less harm to have it then it's going to cause, then it would prevent itself. We see that? Okay. D, Alex?
Yeah, just I was gonna go with this, and then I got to the point where I said, I instead of less, more harmful. Does that make a difference? Because I was putting, like, the example. You have somebody driving on the other side of the road, and then it's more. What is it? It's could be more effectively used if there's a direct type of um explicit harm there. So it's more likely to cause less harm. Would that make a
Yeah.
difference? I see it could, I mean, it's very soft language, so to speak. I kept it open. We're gonna go into D, and we'll see what happens there. But
Well, if
I just
it
wanted to
said
mention.
more, right? That's your question. If it said more, what would it be like? If it said more, I think it's going to be 100% wrong, right? Because it's saying every fair rule for this sort of road coordination effect thing, every fair rule would likely cause more harm than it would prevent, which is to say that if we all decide which side of the road to drive on, we're going to be causing more harm by choosing to drive on one side than we would be if we didn't have a rule at all. Do you see how
Okay.
that would be kind of defeating the passage?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Just take those in pieces. And here's another trick you guys can use, which is every fair rule, right? And then almost like half of the sentence that comes after it, going from that could be effectively used to prescribe which, so right? You can cut almost that entire part out and read the answer choice by skipping those qualifiers. So you can just read it as every fair rule is a rule whose implementation would likely cause less harm than it would prevent. The LSAT loves to do this. It loves to put in these qualifiers in the middle of the sentence, and then you get lost in the spiral of the qualifier and you forget what was originally being modified and then like what the second clause is going to do to the first clause. So when that happens, read the sentence and be like, okay, which part is just describing what's going on? Typically, this doesn't really happen in this sentence because there are no commas in this sentence, but a lot of times, if there's like clause, comma, clause, comma, clause, you can usually remove the middle clause and read the clauses on either side and then construct a sentence together that will mean what it needs to mean without, getting muddled by the modifiers. Does that make sense? Okay, try that out sometimes. It does actually really work. And I'll try to come up with if I see an example, I'll point it out to you guys. Okay, so that's why it's going to be C here. D, there would be little need for formal regulation and enforcement of conventional driving patterns. I'm already a little suspicious because I don't think the author ever said like, hey, we won't need formal regulation or enforcement of conventional driving patterns. So almost doesn't matter what the rest of it says, but it says if all drivers understood and accepted the rationale behind regulation and enforcement. We don't know what that would mean. If they all accept it, they could still be a huge need for formal regulation and enforcement. Think about like drunk drivers, right? Like they're always going to need to be, regulated and enforced. That's a really important part of the puzzle. E, unlike rules forbidding such acts as burglary and assault, those that are designed primarily to prevent the inconvenience and chaos of uncoordinated activities should not involve criminal penalties. First of all, I don't know what the author's opinion is on whether something should or should not involve criminal penalties, other than probably like burglary and assault, right? Like we don't know what the author's view is on whether something should or should not involve criminal penalties. And remember, should is the F word on the LSAT, right? It's like a really strong word. So should's a big deal. The other thing is the passage seems kind of going against this concept, right? The passage seems to want us to remember, hey, there is a lot of that good that comes out of enforcement in these areas that are not on their face, harm preventative. So the author would kind of go against the idea in E as well, even though we also just don't know what the author thinks about involving or not involving criminal penalties. Does that make sense? Okay, let's look at number 25. The author distinguishes between two examples of coordinating rules on the basis of whether or not such rules. So this is like a finish the sentence type of question. When this happens, do yourself a favor and just read the question each time. I know it sounds like a drag. It is a drag. It really is. But do yourself a favor and do that every time, because it'll remind you to follow the sentence from the very beginning instead of like just making stuff up about what you think the sentence said or the question said. So the author distinguishes between two examples of coordinating rules on the basis of whether or not such rules. And I'm also going to try to finish the sentence in my own head, which is, I think it was talking about, because the two examples of coordinating rules was, one was like the car, right, driving on the side of the road, and I think the other one was the anabolic steroids, if that's the two we're thinking about. I think the first one was more like, hey, people are going to get into accidents, and then maybe the second is more like, hey, it doesn't look like anything's going on here, but there is actually something going on here. A, prevent some harm beyond that which consists simply in a lack of coordination. I think so. I think that's it, right? We're talking about, hey, we're not just preventing like the harm that comes from what happens when people drive on the wrong side of the road. We're talking about like the overarching effects of, hey, your choice is either to take anabolic steroids or to lose the edge of competition. So is it distinguishing on the basis of whether or not such rules are intended to ensure conformity to a set of agreed upon standards? I think we already know that. That's what they are. I don't think the author is trying to distinguish using that as a concept. Both of them would do this. C, are they trying to distinguish on the basis of whether or not the rules are voluntarily agreed upon by those affected by such rules? I don't think they're volunteer based. I don't think the author ever told us that they're volunteer based. I think they just talked about whether or not they would subject themselves to it. Yeah, because the penalties themselves seem like they wouldn't be voluntary. D, could be considered justifiable by the legal theorists discussed in the passage. So distinguish between the two examples on the basis of whether they could be considered justifiable by the legal theorists. I think both of them, the legal theorists, wouldn't they like the extension that's happening here? Or maybe they wouldn't, they both wouldn't like it. But either way, I don't see that making a difference for the legal theorists. Are they distinguishing on the basis of whether or not such rules apply less directly to the problem of preventing harm than do the rules against burglary or assault? The author never compares the driving example and the anabolic steroids example to burglary or assault. They're just talking about how both of them are different from burglary and assault. A is saying that we're distinguishing between the examples by saying that one of them is preventing harm beyond that which consists simply in a lack of coordination. So Reggie, I'm sure that you can see that if we all just forgot which side of the road to drive on, there would be utter chaos, right? Like that would be just by the fact that we don't coordinate is going to cause a bunch of harm. On its face, whether some athletes are using anabolic steroids or not, doesn't seem like it's going to cause the kind of chaos of us like just deciding that we don't know what side of the road to drive on a particular day. It's different. It's deeper than that. And that's what the author was getting at when we were reading with Kayla towards the end. The idea was like, hey, fam, it might not look like there's harm happening here, and it might not look like it's directly coming from the lack of coordination, but it is. And that was the distinction the author was making. Whereas in the driving example, it just comes out of the lack of coordination. Whereas in the anabolic steroids, it goes further than that. It's not just about the lack of coordination, it goes deeper.
I think that makes a lot more sense. I think when I was reading the question, I
Mhm.
didn't understand that they were distinguishing between the two examples against each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also oh,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The first sentence of the third paragraph helps a lot too. In some other situations involving a need for legally enforced coordination, the harm to be averted goes beyond the simple lack of coordination itself.
Yep, that's the exact sentence it comes from. And the thing is, Reggie, I'll be honest with you, I don't think I picked up on it either when I was reading with you guys. I don't think I noticed the shift from that example into the next example, and I should have picked up on it. But here's a learning thing for me as well as for you guys. You don't have to pick up on everything. Okay, that's one of the mistakes that students make all the time. They think they have to be perfect as they're reading, and you guys really don't have to be. But ask yourself, as you're eliminating these answer choices, is this something that they did? And they did, right? That you can see, like, hey, fam, if you don't coordinate on the side of the road that we drive on, it's going to be utter chaos immediately. And the answer choice gives me that opportunity to go like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. I think this is what's actually happening. And whatever happens though, even if I didn't pick up on subtle shifts like that, or actually it's not very subtle at all, right? And shifts like that, if I don't pick up on it, I won't be punished as long as I don't make a case for a wrong answer. Right? If I let myself be taken in by B through E, then I'm setting myself up to fail because I'm seeing these answer choices as my sort of rescue. No, I'm in control. I get to evaluate what's going on, if that makes sense. A couple of you guys wanted to talk about 26, and then I think I'll just stick around to answer questions and or talk about law school. I've been doing that towards the end of this class. So if that's enjoyable for you guys, happy to do that for a few minutes. And then there's also Plateau Pulverizer in about 40 minutes. So you can join me for that if you haven't already gotten sick of me. 26. Which one of the following is a rule that primarily addresses a problem of coordination most similar to that discussed in the second paragraph? So this is second paragraph was about the road, right? Yep. I don't know. I'm thinking of like, oh, we couldn't come up with an example when we were reading. I'm looking for some kind of example that would be like, we need coordination for this, right? Like we really do. Maybe something like, maybe the IRS example would work, right? Where we all agree to file taxes to this like one place. I guess there's criminal penalties associated with that too, though. Yeah, I'm looking for something in which we need to coordinate, but I'm not necessarily looking for something that's like it shouldn't be difficult to see that like coordination would be, really helpful here and prevent harm. A rule requiring that those who wish to dig for ancient artifacts secure the permission of relevant authorities and owners of the proposed site before proceeding with their activities. That just sounds like consent to me. That doesn't sound like coordination. Who's coordinating with who? I mean, I guess you could say that the people that are digging are coordinating with the owners, but it doesn't sound like a lot of people to me. I don't know. I don't buy it. B, a rule requiring that pharmacists dispense certain kinds of medications only when directed to do so by the physician's prescriptions rather than by simply settling medicines at the customer's requests. Again, that sounds something like sort of like medically protecting people, or like, again, like a consent thing, like get the consent of the doctor before you give the patient the medication. I'm not seeing coordination here. It's not like a bunch of people agreeing to do the same thing the same way. C, a rule requiring that advertisers be able to substantiate the claims they make in advertisements, rather than simply saying whatever they think will help attract customers. Again, so that sounds more like an honesty thing, right? Be honest, right? Like don't bullshit your customers. Doesn't seem like anyone's coordinating with anyone either. D, a rule requiring that employees of a certain restaurant all wear identical uniforms. Okay, maybe that's coordinating during their hours of employment rather than wearing whatever clothes they choose. Okay. What's the harm that's being prevented though? right? It's not like they're wearing the same uniform and then they're being attacked if they're not wearing the uniform, right? They're just wearing a uniform because that's the rule that they have to follow to work in that workplace. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a harm being prevented, right? We need the coordinating to prevent an actual harm, like driving on the same side of the road. E, a rule requiring different aircraft to fly at different altitudes rather than flying at any altitude their pilot wishes. I think that's right. You know, like, I don't know if you guys like know anything about air traffic control, but like I've heard like they actually follow like similar pathways as they go. Like they like maintain like buddy system almost. So if it's a rule requiring different aircraft to fly at different altitudes rather than flying at any altitude the pilot wishes, imagine if they all decided to go on random altitudes, like us deciding to pick whichever side of the road we ordain upon that day. That would be a complete disaster. So I see harm prevention the same way I see harm prevention on the road. And yeah, that sounds like really important coordination to have. Alex?
Yes, I agree. Harm prevention, E. D was attractive to me because of coordination amongst employees, the harm being, not being compliant to the rule that everyone wear the same uniform.
Yeah.
Although E is a bit more explicit after review.
Right.
I think in the actual setting, me doing the test, I pick D, feel comfortable, kind of move on. But that's, if you can just maybe eliminate D in a more strict way, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so D's wrong because remember when we were reading that like I couldn't come up with an example for what these guys were talking about until they brought up the road thing? Because it's specific, right, Alex? We're specifically talking about rules that coordinate and then prevent harm. We are not talking about just rules like you have to wear a certain outfit. If you wear a certain outfit, like, sure, you may even prevent yourself from being fired, but it's not the coordination that's preventing the harm.
I see.
You see what I mean? Like the fact that they all have to wear identical uniforms doesn't stop planes from hitting each other in the sky.
Yeah,
right? It doesn't stop them. Like if there was some kind of, I don't know, boogeyman that came to attack them during their work hours and only attacked them if they were wearing their regular outfits, then yeah, I'd agree with you. There is a coordination there that's like saving lives, right? There's like a coordination there that matters, right? Like, or if you had said, it's a rule requiring employees of the restaurant all to wear identical uniforms. And if one of them doesn't wear identical uniforms, then maybe like everybody gets fired in every restaurant. Right? You see what I mean? The coordination has to be directly linked to the harm. Whereas in D, I'm just like floundering at how to find that. You would need a really shitty boss and like a lot of assumptions to get to a point where the not wearing the uniform causes the harm.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. I'm going to close out class there and then answer your question after. Ankita, is that cool? Awesome. Thank you everyone for a wonderful class. Hang out with me in Plateau Pulverizer if you still have some juice left today. Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of your weekend. I appreciate you guys.